Today I'm going to demonstrate how to do a welt seam. This is a welt seam from the outside, so it has a stitch parallel to the main seam line, and on the inside you'll note that there is one seam allowance visible and the other seam allowance is trimmed away underneath. This seam is used quite a bit in sportswear, leather goods, outerwear, and generally machine washable things. So you'll see this type of thing on jeans and maybe machine washable coats, or on particularly heavy fabrics that don't press open seams particularly well. So I'm starting with 2 pieces of fabric, and I've put some pins in perpendicular to the sides. We are going to start on the inside of the seam, so I'm going to place the fabric along the second guideline on the Bernina machine. So the second line is for a 1.5 seam allowance. So starting to sew at about a half a centimetre down the seam. This helps to prevent it from puckering at the very, very top. So reversing back to the beginning and then looking only at this 1.5 centimetre seam guide, which will enable me to sew a straight seam. Okay, so taking out the pins as I go and reversing at the very end. So I now need to decide, when I turn this sample out to the correct side, which side I would like the seam allowance to sit on. So the seam allowance can be all pushed to the left or pushed to the right depending on need. So I have chosen, I'm going to place the seam allowance to the left. So laying the fabric down flat, I now need to press that seam open. So starting on the side that has no seam allowance and pressing gently towards the left. So I've now pressed the seam allowance to the left. So for the next stage, I need to trim one of the seam allowances down by half. So the seam allowance that needs to be trimmed is the one on the inside of the seam, or the one that's closest to the outside of the garment. So I need to trim that one down by about a half. Okay, don't trim this one too close because otherwise the seam can rip open. But we don't want it to be visible when we're finished. So just to go over that again, the seam allowance is pressed to this side here, and it's the one closest to the outside that has been trimmed down by half. Now for a welt seam we need to do a top stitch parallel to the seam edge here. A typical welt seam will have a top stitch about 0.7 of a centimetre or 7 millimetres out from the edge. So that happens to be lining the fabric up just under the edge of the foot here, this regular domestic foot. So again, starting about a half a centimetre down from the top edge of the fabric, I'll stitch 2 or 3 stitches and then reverse back to the very beginning. And then again, watching only the edge of the foot here, because I'm trying to sew a straight line, continue sewing. It's useful to hold the side of the fabric on either side of the foot with a welt seam to make sure that you don't end up with a bubble or a pucker as you go along. And down at the very end then doing a small back stitch. So this is the end result. This is the welt seam on the outside. So you can just about see the seam here and the top stitch of sorts, about 7 millimetres to the left. 5 millimetres is about as small as you can go, and I wouldn't really recommend going any wider than 7. So anything between 5 and 7 is perfect for a welt seam. And again, the identifying feature on the back is that there is one single seam allowance rather than 2, because the second one has been trimmed away on the inside. Okay, so on the outside, that is the end finish.